Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting tonight, the Bunurong people of the Eastern Kulin Nations, and to pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And as we always say at New Israel Fund events, we wish and hope for a day where we can say similar words in Israel and Palestine, and that Israelis and Palestinians can also recognise the shared land on which they live. It's really been an honour. We're Thursday night, we're maybe 4 or 5 days in now of the road show, where I've just had the absolute privilege, the team and I have had an absolute privilege to be travelling with Gil and Hiba, and I will leave Sally to introduce them a little bit further. But what has been so special over the last few days is to have been able to learn from and kind of suck in the energy of two real peacemakers. And just a word about the New Israel Fund, although I'm certain that most of you are very well familiar with our work. The New Israel Fund is dedicated to supporting civil society in Israel, specifically to support democracy, human rights, civil rights, and to support peace. And I don't know if you know this fact, but a few years back, the International Board of the New Israel Fund made a decision that 22% of all granting that is made would be directed to Palestinian-led organisations to reflect the roughly 22% of Israeli society, which is made up by Palestinian citizens of Israel. And so naturally, or maybe instinctively over the last few years, we've brought out what we've now kind of called a dual narrative speaker tour. So probably most of this crowd will come to the 2 or 3 events that we're able to host each year. And really just organically, over the last 4 years, we've brought out a Palestinian and a Jewish Israeli to speak together about the work that they do. Sometimes it got more expensive than other times, but it was really important for us to demonstrate and to showcase to the community here that there are Palestinians and Israelis working together. And I just want to stop and thank the Trawalla Foundation and Carol and Alan Schwartz for some foresight that they've had in supporting a tour like this, so that it wasn't just an organic decision made by the New Israel Fund, but something that was really well thought out and even more intentional. And I've seen over the last few days just how gobsmacked some of the people that we have met have been in meeting these two wonderful leaders. And it's just so important to hear these voices. So thank you to the Trawalla Foundation for your support. I will not speak for much longer because we have 3 people much smarter than me that need to say a lot. But I just want to thank you, Sally, again for coming on the journey with us. Sally is the host of the Fifth Estate at the Wheeler Centre, and also organically has been hosting these conversations for us over the last few years, and so we're honoured to have you here again tonight. And I will allow you to introduce Gil and Hiba. Thank you so much.
Be on? Oh, hello, good evening everybody. Thank you, Kate. It's wonderful to see so many of you here on such a perfect Melbourne evening. And I'm so thrilled to be here to do really anything the NIF asks, really. because the work they're doing and the ability they have to keep bringing people here, all the way here, for us to listen to and learn is an incredible achievement, and all the work that's gone on in the past few days that hasn't been on stages. It's just a great thing. Now, just before I introduce our guests, you might see some QR codes around. If you would like to ask a question tonight, you just put your phone on the QR code and type it, and I'm promised it will magically arrive at my phone later on. But I would also encourage you to wait a while before you do, because perhaps your question may get answered along the way. So here we are to talk about what seems almost entirely unthinkable right now, which is peace in the Middle East. Hiba Qasas is a Palestinian woman raised in the West Bank, the founding executive director of Principles for Peace, a Geneva-based think and do tank, advancing new ideas for peacemaking. And for over 2 decades, she's been working across the United Nations and other global institutions. She convenes Uniting for a Shared Future, which is a coalition of over 550 Israeli and Palestinian leaders who work together toward a shared political future. Dr. Gil Murciano is the CEO of MITVIM, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies. Gil's a leading Israeli foreign policy expert. He's an expert on regional security, diplomacy, and Israel's place in the Middle East and the world. And just to tell you the connection point between these two, MITVIM is one of the member organisations of Uniting for Shared Future, which we'll hear more about. So welcome again to you both. We'll begin by just giving you each an opportunity to briefly just tell us a little about yourself and how you managed to be here in Melbourne to be trying to solve the problems of the Middle East.
Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone. Thank you for choosing to come indoors on this lovely evening. It's a real pleasure to be with you. So I'm born and raised in the West Bank, in Nablus. I was shaped by the reality of this conflict, as many of us Palestinians and Israelis. I'm a child of the first Intifada, where my childhood at that time was between, where every trip to school was between rocks and bullets and the insecurity of curfews and difficulties of that moment. I'm also, my teens was a period of hope, the hope of Oslo, the generation that threw roses at the departing IDF cars that were leaving from the West Bank, and early adulthood of the crushed hope of the breakdown of the peace agreement with the start of also the second Intifada, which was a very difficult year where I've had a personal loss, and a year where my house in Nablus was destroyed. And I always say we Israelis and Palestinians alike, we have intergenerational trauma imprinted in our DNA. We deal with it in different ways. For me, it was the fact that I decided to get very fascinated, but what drives violence, how do you build peace, and what peace should deliver. So I dedicated my study and my work to this cause, and worked on it in many different parts of the world, joined the UN, grew in the system fairly quickly, found myself being in Iraq in a leadership position at the years of ISIS, found myself covering the Horn of Africa, and then studying the practice of peace and security in many, many countries, leading research at one point that covered 56 countries, working across the UN in headquarters in the field, and then getting really fed up with the UN and its bureaucracy and its slowness and its lack of imagination. and the fact that we keep doing the same thing again and again and expecting different results, which is the definition of insanity. So I decided to quit the UN, and I started my own organization in Geneva called Principles for Peace to reshape peacemaking, because I love small challenges. And started to work in many conflicts. Now, there's one thing you might have noticed. I did not mention Israel or Palestine, yes, because I decided to avoid it like the plague. I didn't want to touch it. I didn't want to work on it. That was my way of dealing with that trauma until October 7th and the war in Gaza. Because when you cover peacemaking and you understand conflicts, you can recognize an inflection point that changes everything, that changes the reality and the realization of people that the status quo is not sustainable. Conflict management doesn't work. There is no military solution to this conflict. Does not realize the status quo does not provide security to the Israelis, nor dignity or self-determination to the Palestinians. And in the world is starting to get more and more informed and remembering that this conflict travels in polarization and in further instability, and that it cannot be ignored and just normalize around the question of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and everything is okay. So the world was engaged, the people are traumatized, they're shocked, but usually in these moments are the moments that you can change things. So that was the moment when I decided to dive head first back into it and to start to reach out to Israelis and Palestinians, to leaders, to try and build uniting for shared future and take it upon us, the people, the key people with influence, to come together with the failure of the leadership to break the cycle of intergenerational war that we've been stuck in.
Thanks, Hiba. Gil?
Yes, hi. My name is Gil. I guess I'm a Jerusalemite, if I have to think about a core part of my identity. My family lived in Jerusalem for about 300 years, if we go back, which always led us to interesting discussion. If you can define them as Jewish Palestinians back in the days. I used to work at the Prime Minister's office, believe it or not, before Netanyahu, in the prehistorical era, before Netanyahu back then, for a while. And then, just like Hiba, actually, I decided to take a small vacation from the conflict and spend almost a decade in Berlin, actually, serving as an advisor to the Chancellor and to the Foreign Ministry of Germany on Israel and on the Middle East. I also had the privilege to establish a think tank back there that took in refugees and turned them into foreign policy advisors. You remember the great exodus of refugees from Syria, from the civil war in Syria, you know, that you were also probably influenced here by that, into Europe and Germany. So I basically lived among Iranians, Syrians, Iraqis, as an Israeli. It's a lot about how identity is being shaped. But it was clear to me that even before 7th of October, and the tragedy of 7th of October, that it's time to come home, and it's time to try and deal with the tectonic changes that we are feeling in Israel in the last couple of years, and Mitvim, the think tank that I'm leading. I guess, you know, for those of you who know the ecosystem of civil society in Israel, Mitvim is probably the only organization that actually deals with the craft of negotiations, of diplomacy, of peacemaking on that level. You know, when we speak about strategic thinking in Israel, all those things, we mostly speak about national security, the military aspect. The goal of Mitvim is to create a shift in from military-only thinking into a diplomatic understanding, into peacemaking and so on. And that was my mission. After 7th of October, I would say that, you know, we always speak as analysts or experts. We work with our mind. But I think 7th of October was the place where the mind somewhat meets the heart. And for me, it was my experience with the friend that I lost in Kibbutz Be'eri, where 72 hours, I think, after the massacre of 7th of October, we were already engaging in an attempt to build a roadmap that would take this horrible tragedy and would turn it maybe to a source of an Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation. And for me, the connection was always very personal, was about this concept of the Be'eri summit The idea was, imagine that, how do you actually defeat Hamas? The idea that you are creating a conference on the ruins of the destroyed Kibbutz Be'eri, I guess you know the story of Kibbutz Be'eri in the envelope in Gaza, which brings in regional actors, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Palestinians, the Israelis, the Americans, if we don't have any other choice, and we discussed the reconstruction of the region altogether. And when we were looking around and trying to find, in that bleak days, partners for this idea, I would have to say that Hiba and Principles for Peace and this incredible coalition that she established was one of the only ones standing. And since then, that was our goal, that was our direction. I'll stop here and we'll touch upon that later.
It was Ronald Reagan, I think, who first coined the phrase peace through strength. And you describe, Gil, in your work, the current situation as almost entirely military. There is no diplomatic or political plan. What is it that distinguishes this conflict from the previous conflicts?
Yes, peace through strength, by the way, not my words, of course, Reagan, but then Trump and Netanyahu, and this is a completely different meaning. When Reagan, for those of you who remember, when he related to peace through strength, it was about carrying a big stick so you won't have to use it. Nobody would challenge the status quo because you are so strong, deterrence. The Netanyahu version is really about carrying a big stick in order to reshape, the illusion that you can reshape the entire Middle East through military force alone. And by a rejection of any diplomatic, or not, let alone an initiative, a political initiative when it comes to the conflict. And that brings us today, I think, especially after Iran, this is the cord connecting this absolute victory policy of Netanyahu in Gaza, the policy in Lebanon, in Syria, and Iran, I think, is this is the place where the illusion that you can change government overnight through military force alone, and the destructive effect of it when you think about it. Israel, it's a regional power, a military power on a regional level. However, it does not have the ability to do anything on the political level. A Bahraini colleague of ours, if you remember, described this as a weak bully. A country that can take over the airspace of Tehran, infiltrate Natanz and the enrichment, but it cannot do anything on the political level. And therefore, Israelis today, after those horrible 2.5 years, are looking around. And Hamas is still there in Gaza, despite all the power that was used, the destructive power that was used. Hezbollah weakened, still in Lebanon. In Iran, I think that we were better off before this war when it comes to the nuclear issue. And it's really about the inability to take temporal military victories, temporal destructive, sometimes immoral military victories, and convert them to long-term achievements, political achievements, to create really deep security. So I think today, when we speak about peace through strength, I would call it, if you will, peace through force. There's no strength in this specific issue. Today we are in a very rare moment in Israeli perception when Israelis are willing to start speaking about what does it mean security. Security is going to be the major issue. You probably have guessed, 3 months from now, in this crucial moment, those of you who have the right to vote, I urge you to make the 20 hours journey and do that. We always speak about crucial junctures, and somewhat of a cliche. You probably heard about crucial junctures before. This cliche is true. We are in a critical moment. And we are in a critical moment regarding the two-state solution and the resilience of the two-state solution, and the great forces that are trying to erase any a trace of Oslo, of the two-state solution, but also regarding security. Also how we see security, which is the first, second, and third priority of Israelis. So what we try to do right now regarding peace through strength is to create an alternative, to actually build a diplomatic-based security concept. We're working very closely with the Israeli opposition, hopefully soon to be a coalition, in order to implement a new idea that basically, there's nothing new about it. Basically projecting the famous word, I think of, was Cardinal Richelieu, who said that you can do almost everything with bayonets except sitting on them. So this is what we are trying to build.
Hiba, if the questions of how Israelis can live with their Palestinian neighbours is not even being discussed at that political level, how do you talk about, what do you do in your work towards that to get that into the election, into the public conversation?
Before I answer that, I'd like to reflect on this idea of peace through strength or peace through force. There is no peace through force or peace through strength. There is containment. There's a trap of escalation dominance. There's a trap of thinking that you're actually advancing, but not really advancing, and being in a perpetual state of insecurity and fear. And that's what proved the fallacy of this illusion that you could actually achieve peace through force alone. And I think, if anything, October 7th was the proof that that's not the case. Because the whole security doctrine collapsed on its face. Deterrence, intelligence, quick, decisive action. And I think what I'm seeing with many of my Israeli friends, and that I consider that an entry point to be able to engage with many security actors in Israel as pragmatic leaders, is that there is a growing realization that without diplomatic and political pillars to the security doctrine is incomplete. And I think we're seeing this, it's not only, by the way, in Israel, it's a global phenomena. In the past, we are living in one of the least peaceful moments in modern history. We have record number of conflicts, 65 active conflicts globally today. And at best, what we've been successful at globally is achieving a series of ceasefires when the main strategy has been force. It's only when we think in terms of diplomatic and political strategy. I'm not saying that force cannot change the balance of a moment. It can. It can create openings even. But it has to have an end state. Otherwise, it is an incomplete strategy, and you risk becoming trapped in a permanent war footing, which is how many today in the region see. I can tell you for a fact, as someone who convenes not only Israelis and Palestinians, but work across the Middle East and convene dialogue platforms at the highest levels in the Middle East, that today the view in the Middle East is on two destabilizers. One is Iran and its proxies, which is perpetually destabilizing the region. And the growing realization in the region is that also Israel is destabilizing, because the reflex is becoming war. It's becoming use of force. And it's not only about the Palestinians, it's vis-a-vis the rest of the posture. So we are in this moment of reflection, and I think this is where, to answer your question, where I see the entry point. In a time when the public opinion is so polarized, it's so hard, both on the Israeli and on the Palestinian side. But let me focus for a moment on the Palestinian side. In the psyche of Palestinians, just like in the psyche of Israelis, that October 7th is a huge trauma. In the psyche of Palestinians, what happened to Gaza, the devastation of Gaza, that 93% of the population are still living in tents, that everything is destroyed, that every home have lost people, every family have lost people, and some families were wiped off. That is trauma for the Palestinians. It's a catastrophe in the psyche of Palestinians. And I understand from my Israeli partners also the horrific impact and the level of trauma of October 7th in the psyche of Israelis. So you have two populations that are deeply mistrustful of the other. And when identities are shaped by loss and victimhood, it's very normal to dehumanize the other. It's very normal to demonize the other. And it's very hard to find rationality. But in every conflict, and in this case, I've seen that we've managed to find pragmatic leaders on both sides, Israelis and Palestinians, who are thinking with their heads for a moment and thinking, okay, this is not sustainable. It is time for us to expand our understanding of what does it take to generate security for Israel, and what does it take to realize the right of both people for self-determination, independence, and statehood. That a non-militarized Palestinian state is a security imperative for Israel, as it is a self-determination imperative for Palestinians. That the disarmament of Hamas and removing Hamas from power is a self-determination imperative for Palestinians, as it is a security imperative for Israelis. And finding that common ground with pragmatic leaders to work. And I think this is where our strategy has been to find key people with influence on power, on politics, on incentives, those who are close to power today but can actually be in power tomorrow, to work together, and in the absence of direct dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians, to build a constituency in support of a political solution, to rebuild these channels of dialogue, to start to rebuild trust and to rebuild a political agenda that is around enlightened self-interest, because it is the most patriotic thing to do, because it's very easy for those maximalists on both sides, and I say on both sides because God knows there are maximalists on both sides, and God knows in the diaspora, people sometimes are more maximalist than us who are affected on the ground by this conflict. It is possible to find rationality and common ground amongst those pragmatic from both sides, because that's the only way that we can emancipate both people from the reality of fear and from the reality of occupation. And these two are interlinked. And today we're at an opportunity. Gil talked about the crucial juncture of, or did you not? I've been hearing him for 5 days, you know. I might be imagining what he said the last time we spoke.
Do you want me to continue?
No, you're not going to continue this. You know, it's a bit challenging on the 5th day, but you know, he often talks about the crucial juncture that is in front of us today, and I do think that there is an opportunity. And as a Palestinian, my generation blames our leadership for wasting opportunities because they did not have the courage to face hard questions when they were presented with opportunities in past rounds of negotiations, like around Camp David. We will never forgive them for that. Why? Because how many people lost their lives, how much land was lost. And I feel today, and when I talk with my Israeli partners, that they're in the future, in hindsight, if this opportunity of blanket normalization, which the region has made during the New York Declaration, of saying, we all support, while we recognize the state of Palestine, we all support that Hamas should not have a role, that Hamas should be disarmed, that we, as the region, will provide security guarantees to Israel, and we will normalize relations with Israel. And everyone just focus, oh, they recognize Palestine and forget the fourth. That my Israeli partners in the future will look back and say, we do not forgive for flouting this opportunity to move Israel from a permanent war footing and a state of isolation in the region to a real integration where Israel is part of a regional political security and economic framework that secures its prosperity and stability as it secures the right of the Palestinian for a non-militarized Palestinian state, as it secures stability for the whole region, and stopping this phenomena of exporting insecurity, trade route disruptions, energy and inflation to the rest of the world.
Hiba, I want to talk just a little bit more about this principled pragmatism, this enlightened self-interest. You've said that there's no common ground to be found in the past, that common ground does not begin with moral agreement. It begins with self-interest and what you cannot afford to lose. Can you go a bit deeper on that, and how you can actually use that in a practical way with the leaders that you're working with?
I think there's something very honest in recognizing that we deeply care about our own people and about the future of our children and about questions of survival. When Israelis and Palestinians come together, it's hard not to recognize that we have deeply, deeply different national and historical narratives. If we're trying to reconcile on that, it's impossible. If we're trying to reconcile on who's of a bigger victim, it's impossible. If we try to recognize on who, has a right for what, it's impossible. So one of my key strategies is that I don't like to start by dwelling over the past. It's not avoidance. It's an intentional strategy to say, let's look towards the future. What can we not afford to lose? What matters to us most? Is it safety, security, dignity, the future of our children? So you start with that self-interest. Then you go to that transaction. How do we get there? And this is how we worked within the Uniting for a Shared Future. How do we get there? a non-militarized Palestinian state within a regional political and security framework that provides the security guarantees that Israel needs, but gives the Palestinians their right for self-determination. That's a transaction. Then comes recognition of the right of both people for self-determination, for independence, for statehood, for safety, for security, for dignity. And only when you find that common ground, you can reach to something else, which is humanity, recognizing the other. And I've seen this in Uniting for Shared Future. The very first meeting when we brought the first 70, and I call them the first 70 founding members of Uniting for Shared Future, because we didn't know if we were going to end with that meeting. It was March 2024, so everything was so raw. I had Gazan who've lost 35 members of their family in Gaza. I had Israeli partners who've lost their parents in Nahal Oz. I've had a business leader in Israel who lost his daughter, and they were with us at that moment. And you know, when I closed that door in that room, no one trusted anyone. There was no trust in that room. They didn't trust each other, and they didn't trust me, and they didn't trust the whole process. And we stuck around. Today we're 550, and those people are bringing more people. And I really started to observe with time how trust is starting to grow, both in each other, in our process, in our common approach. And that happened because we did not try to, we started doing it for our own people, and then we found the humanity in each other. And we stopped competing on, who's a bigger victim, and we didn't compete over victimhood and relativized pain. But I think it's a process of recognizing the level of trauma that you sound tone deaf if you start from humanity. In a moment where there's so much dehumanization of the other, so much groupthink, where we're sheltering within that by saying the other, it's not at the same level. But if you start with self-interest, with survival, with what you cannot afford to lose, with your own patriotism for your own people, but recognizing that there is common ground, that neither side can achieve safety and security and self-determination in a sustainable way at the expense of the other, then you can reach humanity. But if you start with humanity from the beginning, it really works, in my opinion.
Gil, you mentioned the forthcoming election before was obviously a crucial moment, but there's a real chance that whoever wins the election, the ideology may not change. So what are the most important things from your point of view about this election, and is the messaging of it different?
Yes, connecting maybe the coming election a little bit to this interest-based, everybody's focusing on his interest and we find the overlap. I think that one of the things that we do understand today, the next government, even the next election in Israel, best case scenario, would bring a government of change, but a government that's not going to be necessarily, probably not supportive of the two-state solution. We are thinking about Bennett, Eisenkot, Lapid, Golan, actually, who is basically the only candidate that is really committed to this topic. We are most likely to find a center-right government on that level, with its own limitation. And there's something very interesting, though, about the fact that when we speak about peace, we all grew up, or we were there during the Oslo generation. We tend to think about peace in terms of historical handshakes, Rabin and Arafat on the White House lawn and whatever. We need to understand that today, when we speak about two-state, we need to start speaking about a new paradigm for promoting two-state. In the current situation that we are in right now, of total mistrust, as Hiba mentioned, we are somewhat regressed after 7th October to dealing with an intercommunal conflict, where half of my work is to convince Israelis that not all Palestinians are Hamas, and I assume that the same goes on the Palestinian side. So in that specific situation, we have to start speaking about peace of no choice. The perception that even without mistrust, the implication of not moving forward are so disastrous, so catastrophic that this is almost a necessity. And that relates to the next government. When we speak about what can be done, a lot of our work today, with a little bit of chutzpah, to be honest, is planning the first 100 days of the next government of change. not just on the level of their plans, but also on the level of the coalition negotiations, which ministries are being taken. Because a lot of what we need to do in order to promote two states is not just to define this end game. It's not just to speak about going back to negotiation table, but try and start practice the idea of two states on a daily basis, to take over the effects on the ground itself. You know, I'm not ashamed to say that on this issue, I'm finding myself inspired by the unfortunate success of the Israeli right. You know, the Israeli right, when they decided to start annexing the West Bank, you know, they didn't went out on the podiums and made statements, they just started doing on the ground. And we need to do the same thing. What does it mean to do on the ground? And this is really about the next government. First of all, it's about rolling back annexation, all those important developments that Hiba mentioned here and that we are relating to. We are in a situation where there's a government who's currently working to bring the Palestinian economy into a collapse. That's one of Smotrich's ideas. We are in a situation, I don't know if you follow the Australian government decision to join a coalition of countries that warn anyone who's is going to be involved in building an E1. It sounds like a very odd description of a place, but we are talking about places that if settlement activity is going to happen there, then I can tell you the idea, the feasibility of a Palestinian state is gone, is off the table. So we are really talking about the resilience. Rolling back annexation is one of the great, or the first missions of the next government. Can we expect a Bennett government, Bennett, that used to be the head of the settlement movement in Israel, can we expect them to move forward into two-state and define new pathway? Absolutely not, if you ask me. But can we expect them to fall under the umbrella of the 20 points plan of Trump? We didn't mention Trump beforehand. You know, one of the features of Israeli loss of any political initiative is the fact that Israel does not necessarily, the government of Israel today, does not really control the decision-making over Israeli security. I don't know if you noticed. Decisions about Iran, Gaza, Lebanon. And you know, I'm very thankful when it comes to Trump imposing a ceasefire on Netanyahu in Gaza. I always say, I am very thankful, I can't believe I'm saying that. I'm very thankful, wait until the end of the sentence. I'm very thankful for President Trump, yes, for saving the people of Israel from the government of Israel. But it's not a long-term recipe. So when we think about the next government, it's about blocking. But it's not just about blocking. It's also taking the practical steps to promote two-state solution. One example, and just one. If you ask me what is the most important practical political game changer that would define the next 2 or 3 decades of Israeli-Palestinian relations, I will say reconstruction. Reconstruction of Gaza. Now, you might think I'm talking about some logistical, humanitarian, or pipelines and debris. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the decision who's going to rebuild Gaza and how Gaza is going to be rebuilt. You know what? The same in Lebanon. Who's going to rebuild the south of Lebanon and how it's going to rebuild is going to define the conditions or preserve or influence the long-term security of Israelis and Palestinians and Lebanese in this case, more than any other aspect, more than 1 more kilometer of a security zone or whatever you. And this is what I'm referring to. The next government can enter this issue. Hiba and I work very closely with the Gazan Technocrats Committee, with Ali Shat and with the specific, we're talking about the Gazans who are taking the hard work of trying to rebuild in Gaza, to reconstruct. And the idea is not just to reconstruct, it's to create a mechanisms that also build the Palestinian statehood, basically, through this process of reconstruction. These are things that are not just necessary and urgent, but they are also tailor-made to the next Israeli government. And this is, I think, what makes us a little bit different. We are not activists. We are policy people. Yet there's a concept about Aseh Shalom Verodfeu, Rodef Shalom, the seeker of peace. It means that everywhere you can actually enter, in every space, even if it means State Department and everywhere you can actually enter, you are actually walking there. And that's, I think, what makes, we are trying to influence what it actually matters.
Whatever the outcome of that election, the rebuilding of Gaza is going to also meet with bureaucracy, with peace-building bureaucracy for anything to happen. Hiba, you gave a great TED talk where you should have a look up her TED talk, and you talked about, and you mentioned this in your introduction too, where you described peace as overly bureaucratised. And a quote from your talk where you said, "We've built an entire industry around it, a Western liberal model. The peace builders and mediators come in. They launch dialogues, push for elections, train police, launch stabilisation programs, add grassroots, women, maybe a sprinkle of some youth." What has to change with the peace bureaucracy to meet whatever government is there to rebuild?
I'm starting to regret my TED Talk at this tour. I mean, look, maybe three points here. One is that, you know, when we think about the industry of peacemaking and peace building, it's become so bureaucratized and sequenced that it lost touch with the nuance and the priorities that people have. And I'll give you very concrete examples. Today, if you're talking about the President Trump plan, which actually the components of it actually make perfect sense. A transitional governance, a stabilization force that comes in to stabilize the situation, to train the Palestinian police. A reconstruction plan, a higher representative, because people don't trust the Palestinian Authority, so they say we're going to create an international oversight and reform mechanism. All of it, on the face of it, from a design perspective, is perfect. When it comes, beside the fact that it doesn't include enough Palestinians, so the Board of Peace is kind of headed by, the top three are Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and Aryeh Lightstone, all with very deep connections to Israel and US, but no Palestinians there. Now, putting that aside, but in terms of technical design of the process, it looks perfect. The biggest problem here is implementation. How do you actually realize that on the ground? There's a crisis of legitimacy surrounding institutions today. You know, no one trusts, for example, the UN. People don't see the value added of the Board of Peace right now because they're thinking it's going to replace the UN, but it's not legitimate. You have such level of fragmentation in the international system. People don't believe in international law anymore. There's a complete erosion of the international system. So everything is in flux. It almost feels like the old system is dying and the new one has not been born yet, and we don't know where we're heading. We're in an era where might is right again, you know, where power politics are the main organizing factor, and transactionalism is seriously in fashion. And how do we recalibrate? How do we deal with this? How do we deal with this reality? And the answer here is that we have to go into new forms of engagement. We have to get coalitions of the willing. We have to get the whole ecosystem of power, of politics, of incentives working together to create a different reality. And all the institutions and bureaucracies are not able to function on that. So I wasn't denying the importance of inclusion, but I was saying that you can't start everything by over-romanticizing everything grassroots and you know, it's either bottom up or top down. Maybe it's just middle out. You know, maybe it's about engaging the whole ecosystem. Maybe we have to think in a different ways and create coalitions of the willing that are coming around enlightened self-interest to create a different kind of reality. So in my TED Talk, I was challenging the notion of linearity. I was challenging the notion of overly bureaucratized peacemaking. I was saying that it's all of our business, all of us, because it's affecting all of us, and we have to be very pragmatic and very concrete to try and change this reality.
I'll shift now to Australia, because there's so much still to talk about, but obviously here we've had rising anti-Semitism since October 7th, and of course the Bondi massacre, and now a royal commission. It doesn't feel the idea that a royal commission is going to fix the problems here is fanciful, whatever good can come out of it. That there are such deep issues in Australia that have landed here that are not even being examined in the Royal Commission. What is it in a country like Australia when it's here, it's everywhere? How can it be addressed here, far away?
You know, it's not unique to Australia. This is a very, very internationalized conflict. It's incredibly polarizing, and everyone has an opinion about it. People who know about it and people who know nothing about it, they equally have an opinion about it. And I find, and I said this before, I find sometimes amongst those who don't know enough about it, their position is even more polarized and more righteous and harder than those who know a thing or two about it. And I find that sometimes it is harder amongst the diaspora than it is harder by people who are affected by it. And I think it's not unique to see that this is one of the conflicts where it's so visible. And here in Australia, I think, you know, one of the messages we wanted to bring with us here is also a message of solidarity after Bondi Beach, and also to remind Australians that if a Palestinian Israeli like us, and many of us, are working together to try and advance a political solution, while trust, I'm pro-Palestine, he's pro-Israel, but both of us know that the most thing to make me pro-Palestine and the best thing to make him pro-Israel is to be pro-solution. If we are able to do that, why can't people on the outside see that? So we're taking upon us to pass this message, but I think we have a collective responsibility because a lot of factors are working against us. The algorithms are working against us. Misinformation is working against us. Irresponsible leadership is working against us. Those who want to polarize us, the right, extreme right-wing governments in many parts of the world, in Europe. I mean, who are the ones who are stoking also in Europe, you know, anti-solution sentiments? It's the extreme right. They're not the best friends of Jewish people when they're talking about anti-Semitism. I'm sorry, these are the parties that we know their background. And also those who sometimes are making very, very strong pro-Palestine statements and shouting from the river to the sea. I mean, I want them to shout from the river to the sea where everyone is free. Israelis and Palestinians are free from the reality of insecurity and safety and occupation, where both Israelis and Palestinians are exercising their right for self-determination, independence, and statehood. That's the chant I want to hear. It's not I don't want people to pay attention to us. I want them to pay attention to us. Because this conflict will not be resolved by the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority. There isn't enough political will. And for a peace process to become a reality, it needs political feasibility, it needs psychological feasibility, and it needs physical feasibility. The physical feasibility, we can argue it's there. Why with all the settlements? Because still we have the maps, we have the data, we have the information, and our partners, both in Israel and Palestine, have all of that mapped out, and we know that you can actually create a separation between the two people up to now, if E1 is not constructed. That's why it's very important that there are deterrence action around that. The psychological feasibility, public opinion is very, very hard today. So, you know, Gil usually says, you know, if you ask Israelis about support to two-state solution, it's around a third of the population who support it, which is the same amount as those who support annexation in Israel today. In Palestine, if you ask about support to a two-state solution, it's 71%. But also in Israel, if you offer the Israelis a package, and our partners in Israel have done that in the polling, of offering a non-militarized Palestinian state as part of a regional normalization framework without Hamas being in power, more than 55% support the solution.
Including 62% of those who define themselves as center or center-right. This is fresh data, basically.
Yeah. So there is prospects there. And there's history that shows us that with the right leadership, even historically, after the 1973 war between Egypt and Israel, it was inconceivable to think that there would be a peace between Egypt and Israel. It took the kind of leadership, the kind of statesmanship. That's at that moment that my Israeli partners always talk about, when he came in and made his address in the Knesset, and there was peace between Egypt and Israel. But it takes the last feasibility, the political will. And that today is not there. So that's why we need today international engagement. That's why we need the diaspora community. That's why we need regional partners, because the solution, unfortunately, is not going to come from the leadership. We need to create the sandwich. We are trying to create it from the ground in building coalitions like ours, but we are also working in allyship with international and regional partners, and that was the other thing we were trying to do here in Australia, to get also the Australian government to do more with our partners in Europe and in the US and elsewhere, to create that pressure, incentives, package that can move the process forward so we can advance a political solution.
What about the Australian government, Gil?
Well, just a word before the Australian government. And, you know, of course, we assume some modesty in trying to describe the Australian situation. I just learned 3 days ago it's Bondi and not Bondi, and there's no city called Cairns, but it's Keynes. So, I mean, I assume a certain element of humility. Just regarding, this is a very important piece of information, because there is a tendency to believe, when you're looking at the trends here, that it, in many ways it imitates what we see in Israel since 7th of October, that the Israeli population is now going towards the right since 7th of October. And yes, when you ask Israelis which strategy should we apply in order to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, only a third say two states. By the way, the same amount that say that support the annexation of the West Bank and Gaza. And then, as Hiba mentioned, when you offer them a tangible package, suddenly a schizophrenia, you know, a split identity, suddenly 55%. So, you know, we need to understand that we Israelis today, when you read this data, you understand that there is no ideological rejection of the two-state solution. Israelis today are not allergic to the Palestinian Authority. Rather, they do not believe in the feasibility of a solution. It's almost a mirror image to what happens in the Palestinian, with the Palestinian population. And therefore, it requires two major things even before we enter the Australian government on that level. First of all, a plan, a tangible plan that we can present that would provide security for both people. And second of all is leadership. And I'll touch in a second. Australia, going back to the topic. Look, I mean, I think that, and I can only share that also a little bit based on my Berliner experience being part of a community. You know, this fear that sometimes we feel about criticizing because we know it might be used against us by the radicals on the other side, the BDS campaign. I think the name of the game, and I leave it to you to decide how to do that, is the ability to differentiate between criticism of policy, of the occupation, of annexation, and between delegitimization, between the rejection or the struggle against the right of Israel to exist. Those lines that are passing between the issue, they are somewhat blurred. And it's not a coincidence. There are two major actors that are trying to blur them. On the one hand, the BDS campaigns, who are claiming that there is no difference between Tel Aviv and Yitzhar, you know this. And on the other hand, the extreme right in Israel, who says the same thing, that there is no difference between Tel Aviv and Yitzhar. They are all part of Eretz Israel, the greater Eretz Israel. So when we dismantle, when we empower criticism, because as a democratic country, that's what we do, and we are fighting against the hate speech and in this specific aspect, anti-Semitism, of course, I think that's a tool, and how to do that, it's complicated. Australian government. Look, we understand today, and Hiba mentioned that the shockwaves of what's going on, what happens in Gaza are felt very well across the sea towards the Arab Gulf, and unfortunately all the way into Bondi Beach. So there's the globalization, if you will, of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the good news is, and I think this is something maybe the only piece of non-bad news, I will call it, is that there's a sense of urgency among countries of the region, the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Egyptian, the Jordanian, international. I think our coalition is composed of almost a dozen of different governments from the UK and Germany and others, all the way to Saudi Arabia, because suddenly, and I go back to the interest issue, with all due respect, they are acting on their own interest. They understand that the continuation of this conflict endangers them domestically and endanger us all geopolitically. Prices of fuel, that you probably felt yourself, fertilizer, food security, all those issues. So we are connected. Again, another cliche that is true. And therefore, the question is where Australia stands regarding that. If it is a globalized conflict, then obviously Australia as a regional leader has a role within a coalition in doing what we are now describing. Blocking, doing the practical work, joining a coalition that try to promote practically the practical game changers regarding the two-state solution. You know, and everybody is talking here, we heard it a lot about the sanctions, you know, over Ben-Gvir and Smotrich that the Australian government decided to join, and I welcome them, and I think it's a super important step. But I have to tell you something, and I'm swimming against the tide here, as usual, not against your tide, but generally. This is the low-hanging fruit. If you ask me what is the most meaningful step that the Australian government joined a coalition of the willing, I would say I would speak about the resistance of those settlements, because this is targeted in order to create policy influence. And when we are focusing on those specific issues, this is where the Australian government, as part of a coalition, could actually join and create. And this is just the first phase. I think that if we have a new Israeli government that is willing to move step by step in reconstruction in Gaza, in rolling back certain decisions regarding annexation, in allowing the PA to come back to Gaza through this process of reconstruction, things that are not expensive from a political point of view, that are feasible with this government. I know because I used to work with the previous government of change. Lapid Bennett, you probably, it seems like it was 2 decades ago, it was a couple of years ago. There is a feasibility to promote it. And then when I think about Australia as part of this coalition of promoting those ideas, I think it is a step that is about Australia's role in the world, but also about domestically, about the way we all project in every country almost around the world from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on our own domestic situation.
I'm going to turn to your questions. I'm going to ask one more question. It's different, Gil, but I away from policy, but right back to your PhD research, where you, I haven't proofread it, but it's a very interesting topic. Where you looked at the role of honour and humiliation in trying to understand conflict in the Middle East. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, because it seems to me some research that should be brought back from wherever it is buried.
I think this is the most risky endeavor ever, to ask a scholar to speak about his. How much time do you have? Do you have babysitters and whatever? Because so page one.
I mean, it's a topic that gets to the heart of misunderstanding, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we tend to overlook the role of emotional factors. You know, politics and negotiations about the hardcore military and economic. The role of honor. You know, when we think about honor, humiliation, pride, dignity that you mentioned before. I mean, you know, when we look at the 7th of October, you know what? If you think about 7th of October, yes, it was an intelligence failure, it was a systemic failure, but it was also humiliation, a formative humiliation for Israelis, you know, to lose the ability to control you, to stop an invasion, sexual violence that was involved in that, by the way. All those aspects relate to humiliation, and what happens to you? When you are humiliated, you throw away all the restraints and all the traditional thinking and all the limitations, and you act upon a gut feeling with the urge, interesting, with the yearning to counter-humiliate. And what do we have there? You know it, the story. This self-intensifying cycle of actions and reaction. Each round, humiliation, counter-humiliation, counter-humiliation, voila. That's maybe the story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if I'm not trying to impose my PhD on the entire conflict. But I mean, when you think about 7th of October and how it causes Israelis to adopt an automatic zero-sum game, all or nothing dynamic vis-a-vis Palestinians, and drop certain taboos in warfare, international law that you mentioned, sexual violence, all kinds of, because if you are humiliated, that's it. There's a zero-sum game. Now I'm trying to think, and I don't know how you see it, but regarding the Palestinians on this issue. You know, Palestinians experienced still experiencing a constant humiliation. When we spoke about, you mentioned Israel, Egypt, and the landing of Sadat back in the days. You know, we would never reach peace with Egypt without 1973. You know, without the Egyptians feeling that they have regained their honor. They crossed the canal. And that was the condition for Sadat landing in Israel. When I think about the Palestinians never had a 1973, a moment of regaining honor. And therefore, when I think about 7th of October, maybe the first military victory by Hamas, you know, but even that moment is covered by shame, by the horrible, you know, massacre, by killing women and children, sexual violence. So even that moment is robbed. But you know, I think, and I'll just end with that, because really, the interesting thing about humiliation and honor is that the same thing that happens to you when you are humiliated, we all know it from interpersonal relations, this gut feeling, throwing all restraints, the same thing happens to you when somebody honors you. Think about the landing of Sadat in Jerusalem, 1977. It didn't change his position at all. You know, if you remember, Sadat gave a speech in the Knesset. It was a super hawkish speech. He didn't move an inch. But by the gesture itself, he changed the entire situation. So maybe, I don't know how we find opportunities to honor in this conflict. Maybe we can also find a solution. Maybe honor is not just the stuff that escalations are made of.
A question here from the audience, and thank you for your questions. Why should Palestinians have to live in a demilitarized state if Israel retains its military might?
Would you like to answer? You want to answer that? Before I answer that, I want to reflect on the question of honor and dignity. You know, as Gil was talking about it, I was reflecting on, you know, personal experience. And I was reflecting on back home, today the situation in the West Bank, because I talked a bit about Gaza. You know, one of the things that Smotrich did, because we talked about Ben Gvir, so it's time to talk about Smotrich. As Minister of Finance, he blocked the return of the tax revenue that is collected by Israel on behalf of the Palestinians. And he blocked banks from doing transactions with the Palestinians in terms of currency circulation. Now, what did this do? This is the majority, almost 80% of Palestinian revenue. Palestinian civil servants, which is the majority, by the way, because the others who used to work in Israel, the 200,000 lost their capacity to work in Israel because they lost their permits after October 7th. So the majority of Palestinians today have not been paid a full salary since October 2023. Sometimes they pay 20%. Some months they paid mid-month 30%, sometimes 50%. The health sector today works 2 days a week in Palestine because there's no money. So there's a constant financial strangulation. Talking about humiliation, when parents cannot provide anything for their children, even if they're middle class, but they've depleted everything for the past 3 years. Talk about my 80-year-old mother trying to go to visit my sister, but she's worried about being attacked by violent settlers because there's complete impunity today in the West Bank, and thousands are being attacked, and no one can do anything about it. We are trapped in this conflict, in this deep sense of indignity. So to answer your question, I don't give two flying about having weapons in Palestine. I don't want a militarized Palestine. I want a safe and secure Palestine. And do we want to think about the asymmetry that exists there? I want something feasible. That's what I want. I want a non-militarized Palestinian state that lives in safety and security with all its neighbors. That's what I want. It's not, why do I have... This is the problem with sometimes diaspora or people who know very little about this conflict. Not judging you, but just saying, do you actually think for the average Palestinians, they actually like the fact that Hamas has weapons? Today, that Palestinians in Gaza had to pay everything of their life and dignity. Professors of universities who had beautiful homes on, seaside, who are for 3 years living in tents. Parents, my friend who I used to recognize, and one time I lost contact with her for 6 months, and then I got on a video call for the first time and I couldn't recognize her because how emaciated she was. You think she wants weapons? No, we want dignity. We want self-determination. We want freedom. We want a formula that would work tomorrow, not in 50 years. That's principled pragmatism. I want to emancipate my people from the reality of occupation. That's what I want. And I don't want to do it at the expense of the other. I want to assure the other so I can gain my own freedom. That's the formula I want.
Question from someone in the audience who writes, I am 11 and I was wondering what should kids my age learn to create peace amongst Palestine and Israel? And I've got two 11-year-olds at once, and I would like an answer to that question too. Because, if you're 11 today, wherever you are, thank you for your question. You have already seen so much trauma and history. How do you answer that question for helpless kids who are not under direct threat?
First, I think this kid, wherever you are, you're not helpless because you're already doing something because you're here. You're already doing something because you're asking the question. And I think you need to hold on to that because I think this is the issue. We need to open our horizons. We're in an era where, with all the misinformation, with all the entrenchment in our own position, and our identities become so sometimes claustrophobic that it becomes difficult. And my advice to all parents is to open the imagination and the minds and hearts of their kids. I think that's what saved me, in my case, because my parents always pushed me to question and to think and to put myself in other people's shoes. So I would say keep your curiosity, try to learn more about the other, and don't get trapped into the formula of othering and losing the humanity of the other, which is sometimes a fault of the adults.
Just very shortly, because I think Hiba said it all, but meet Muslims, Palestinians, Arabs, by the way, not just on this level of conflict, as many different people as possible. The idea that we grew up with, that you can be pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian, and since then was erased completely by narratives, by media, by whatever, this idea can come back with fresh thinking. We are already somewhat tainted, all of us, I guess. And one of the things that really, really depresses me, sorry for bringing not hope, but depression on that level, is when you look at the views of the youth. I don't know about the Palestinian side, but the Israeli side. Today I heard that among first-time voters in Israel, about 67% of them define themselves as right-wing. And we are talking about education system. Part of what we are working on, when we speak about reforms. So we speak about reforms in the Palestinian Authority regarding education, and you all know the discussion about textbooks and about the contents, and this is one of the major conditions presented by the EU and others, and it's good that it's there. It's definitely important to invest in this change in education. But I'm asking myself, how we are going to do that also in the Israeli side? When I look at my niece's textbooks, that's not what I learned. I mean, we need to go, when we speak about a government of tikkun, a government of change, I would start with education. And you know, when we speak with the opposition and we speak about the portfolio they have to choose, with all the respect to foreign affairs and all the respect to the security and all those high level, education. If we can bring education to the left side of the future government or to the center side of the next government, maybe we can really answer the question of this wonderful 11-year-old that I cannot see right now. Yeah, that's about it.
We're going to have to wrap it up in a little while, but I would like to hear from both of you about hope, and not in a way that ends poor books that, you know, will have 12 chapters telling you that, you know, the world's about to be cooked with climate change, but then put it actually onto younger people. It'll be okay, here's the hope, because the younger generation will fix it, or the Indigenous dreaming will fix it. There's always some last chapter kind of bit that puts responsibility onto people that clearly have enough to do. So I'm wanting a really, you know, I'm looking at you both. I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you do this as a full-time job, and where I often feel very hopeless about this situation. So where does hope rest for each of you?
It's not a full-time job. It's a full-time cause. You know, maybe just to explain it, I have a 22-year-old son. And a few days after October 7th, he asked me a question. He said, will we ever see peace back home? And I caught myself answering with the words of my late father, and I only recognized after I uttered them. My first reaction was that not in my lifetime, maybe in yours. And I finished saying these words as a woman who works on rethinking peacemaking. And it was almost, you know, when you feel like there's a tank of cold water being poured over your head, I felt like a fraud in that very moment. How irresponsible of me to transmit this intergenerational trauma, this burden to my son. No, it has to be in my bloody lifetime, and if this is the last thing I'm going to do, I'm going to get on with it. I think hope is to make the decision, not to go with naive hope, you know, tomorrow we're gonna have peace, but actually to try and do something about it, to try and find that common ground, to try and find that compromise, to try and find that enlightened self-interest, to try and do something about it, and not to try to go alone. Because there's power in numbers, there's power in community, there's power in joint leadership, there's power in building people's power. That's what we need to do, because right now our leadership is not going to do it. So what gives me hope, one, is seeing possibility. I'm not a naive person. I've learned a lot about conflict, and I've been shaped by it. I know the brutality of conflict. But I'm a possibilist. I refuse to surrender to cynicism, to inertia, because what's the alternative? So I think for me, drawing hope is from determination, and honestly what keeps feeding it, in my case, is the more I'm making partners on the other side. Every Uniting for Shared Future coalition meeting I host in Geneva, and I host at least 2 per year in Geneva, and we do a few when I manage to get into Israel and I manage to go to Palestine, which is a few times a year, and I meet with my partners, and I see that they're continuing and they continue to show up, and I see that we're building trust. I get hope because we have so much more in common than we think. And there are opportunities around us. We just have to have the courage to open our political imagination. There is possibility, but it takes courage and it takes action, and it does not take righteous principles sitting from a high horse. It does not take couch activism, those who just criticize everything online. and just, troll people online for believing in possibilities. It takes action. So I think that's a kind of hope I would like to see. I'd like to see hope as an action, not just as a sentiment.
Our time is very fast coming to an end. You don't have hope, Gil? Do you want to answer it? Of course you do.
Just say that really in 2 sentences, that would take between 15 to 20 minutes. An Israeli answer. No, I mean, I just want to say in the most simplest of ways, I'm not going to speak about narratives, I really draw hope on the most immediate level from the people around me. This is a real privilege to lead such an amazing group of people at Mitvim. I mean, people that are committed on a different level, that would come back from the demonstration for the democratic future of Israel, back to the analysis and, between the... it's just amazing to be surrounded by such people, In civil society, it's not a paycheck, I can promise you. Nobody gets rich from what we do. And then when you go out to the world and you find the interest, and you find, by the way, from the fact that you showed up in this beautiful day, basically in Melbourne, and the cooperation that we have, and how we, in the process, learn not just to complete each other in parole, but also to try and support and advance each other on that level. So in the end, I know it's not some huge pathos of an answer, it's the people around us. That's what kept us, I think, in the last 2.5 years of absolute abyss and absolute catastrophe.
Something you said to me the other day actually gave me some hope, and you very casually mentioned that he used to, at a time, was advising the then Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, on foreign policy. And I just thought about that, the idea that we could have Israeli Gil advising a Chancellor of Germany on Middle East foreign policy once, of course, would have seemed impossible. So, so wonderful to hear from you both tonight. We've not quite finished. There's a very short film that the NIF would like you to see before Rick comes up and closes the evening. So if you can just take a couple of minutes to watch this. It's about 3 minutes.
Since October the 7th and the war in Gaza, so many things have been shattered, and it's hard to believe sometimes that this is our reality. These past years have brought devastation and disaster worse than any of us could have imagined.
كل يوم أنا ببيت عالمين ליד אשתי. מנסה לחשוב, מנסה לעכל, מנסה לנתח. אין פירוש לזה. הוא הרג אימא מוסלמית, שומרת, אימא ל4 בנות.
אני מבקשת לקרוא לפה לכל האימהות. כולכם אימא של מנכ"ל, ביחד נחזיר אותם הביתה, עכשיו!
צריך לעשות שינוי ערבי, יהודי, כל מי שחי במדינה הזאת צריך להיות גוף אחד.
Arabs and Jews, Israelis and Palestinians have responded with bravery and determination. They are helping communities brutally attacked by Hamas, and they are holding on to humanity as they strive for a safe and shared future. And finally, a big ray of hope. You, our supporters, you and your outpouring of concern and overwhelming generosity make all of this vital work possible.
Hi everyone, Rick Benjamin, Chair of NIF. I just want to make some closing remarks, but first please give a huge round of applause for Hiba, Gil and Sally. I think Hiba and Gil are a perfect example of policy wonks with passion can drive a great deal of change. And I also would like to thank Alan and Carol and the Trolla Foundation for helping this event come on. So I want to give you three dates to reflect on. One is 50 years ago, one's 20 years ago, and one's today. 50 years ago, the Soweto massacre happened in South Africa. Somewhere between 400 and 1,000, mostly young kids, slaughtered in an afternoon. If you had said to anyone there, or any parent of any grieving parent, that in less than 20 years you would have a black president of a democratic South Africa, they would not have believed you. Point one. 20 years ago, Dr. Simone Simard discovered the mycorrhizal connection in forests between plants. Why is that relevant? If we think about forests and how they regenerate after bushfires, there is much more that happens below the ground than we can see above. But when they sprout and when the ecosystem of forests bloom, they are a joy to be in and they produce life for us. But it's what happens underground that you don't see that is more important. And I don't think NIF's a fungus, but I do know our work goes underground. And it's the connections that we make between activists, like you saw on the screen, and passionate people that means that the energy that exists to support the work that these amazing people do in bringing together the 500 policymakers and politicians and thinkers and corporate professionals. If the work is not being done to support those people, then they will lose the ability to perform. If the work is not being done to support the activists who quite literally are putting their lives on the line, I think to myself, how can I walk away from that? We have a responsibility, if we're concerned about what's going on in Israel-Palestine, to do whatever we can from Australia to ensure the people who are literally putting their lives on the line and trying to create a new future, they need our support. So that QR code unfortunately disappeared, but I'm sure you can find us at nif.org.au, and that's what today's about. So I said 50 years ago, 20 years ago, today. So today is about, for NIF and for myself, why do I do this work? It's because we need to be there every step of the way. When I go to Israel, my Palestinian and Israeli colleagues, first thing they say to me is, thank you for being here. Thank you for coming. And the second thing they say to me is, how's it in Australia? We hear it's really bad to be a Jew. Right? They're not talking about themselves. They are just thankful for what we do. And I think we owe that to them. So when you go home tonight, please think about what you've heard today from Gil and Hiba. Sally, again, thank you. And we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you very much.